As war became a way of life, Villa's army emerged as the most daring and feared armies of the North. Villa claimed he was forced into becoming a bandit because of a tragic boyhood. He grew up in the Durango state and was the son of a sharecropper. He became an outlaw after shooting and killing a landowner who he claimed raped his sister. Forced to go on the run, he joined a gang of cattle rustlers. He changed his name from Doroteo Arango, his name is not Villa, to Francisco Villa to honor a recently killed bandit chief. Perhaps you've heard of the tradition of the Dread Pirate Roberts. Same thing. Mexicans distinguish between banditos and ladrones, who were thieves. A bandit is like a Robin Hood. He robs from people only who already have more than they need. During the harsh revolution, Villa often gave away food to impoverished villagers. He always tried to have a journalist present when this happened. He liked to promote his image as a man of the people. Villa's skills as a lifetime bandit equipped him to fight what he considered as a holy war against Huerta. His first major victory was in Ciudad Juarez, the same city he had captured from Madero 3 years earlier. Villa's cavalry charges were famous for their fury. His cavalrymen were known as the Dorados, or the Golden Ones, because of the golden color of their uniforms. Villa always led these charges personally. He was very imposing, over 6 feet tall, 200 pounds. He fell often while walking, but he was very graceful on a horse. And because they had to cover great distances, the armies of the North traveled on trains. Horses rode in the cattle cars, artillery on flat cars, soldiers on box cars, and officers in the caboose. Trains were always overcrowded, and younger soldiers were assigned to sit on the roofs of the box cars. The Federal armies also relied on trains. Therefore, Mexico's northern railroad lines became long, narrow battlefields. Hand-pumped cars or old engines were loaded with dynamite and used as torpedoes. Retreating armies tore up tracks. Track-laying engineers and locomotive mechanics, therefore, became as vital as horse soldiers. Now, in the Northwest, Obregon battled Federal troops. Obregon was a science buff, an inventor, and acted far more cautiously and rationally than Villa. Before attacking a town or hacienda, he would survey the terrain and would always capture the high ground near his objective for maximum advantage. He was an avid reader. He knew the techniques of Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon. He deployed his troops with great skill. As war spread over the country, successful armies grew in number, weapons, and strength. Guerrilla units would attach themselves to the best revolutionary armies. Consequently, Obregon's army became one of the most powerful in Mexico. The core of his army remained his Yaquis, who hated Huerta and rich people in general. They fought as if death didn't concern them. But their fierceness and Obregon's brilliant tactics allowed them to become an almost unbeatable army. Now, in theory, both Obregon and Villa were under the command of the self-appointed first chief, Carranza. Many of his orders, however, were ignored by Obregon and Villa. Carranza disliked war and field conditions. He traveled in a private 3-car train with his private chef, and he was in his 50s and was considered an old man, therefore, by his fellow revolutionaries, and he had a frustrating inability to make up his mind in a crisis. Villa called him Old Goat Whiskers. He was really more of a politician than a soldier. In the South, the Zapatistas were more of an insurgency, really, than an army. They rarely fought on well-defined fronts. Instead, raided small towns and haciendas. When they were overwhelmed by federal troops, they would put down their rifles and simply melt into their surroundings. They would act like stupid yokels when asked about the Zapatistas. As long as they held their land, they didn't really care who was in charge in Mexico City. The Federal Army suffered defeat after defeat. Federal soldiers deserted in droves. As the Army dissolved, the government of Mexico City almost ceased to function. Taxes went uncollected. Services came to a halt. Law gave way to anarchy. Huerta brooded in downtown saloons over glasses of cognac. By early 1914, 3/4 of Mexico was in rebel hands, with Huerta controlling only central Mexico. Revolutionaries opened prisons and invited the prisoners to join them. Some did, and some just terrorized the countryside. Mines went unattended. Cattle roamed. Weeds overwhelmed corn patches. Family life splintered as men from 14 to 70 went off to fight. The role of women underwent profound change. In pre-revolutionary Mexico, women were essentially servants. No vote, severe restrictions to owning property. Even upper-class women only went to school long enough to acquire basic reading and writing. But the demands of the revolution allowed women to gain new respect from men. Camp women had historically attached themselves to armies throughout the world, but in Mexico. They foraged for food, they cooked, they slept with the men. But in the Revolution, camp women began to pick up the rifles of fallen soldiers and fight. If they survived, they never returned to their old positions of servitude, becoming instead soldaderas, the feminine form of soldier. Gradually, they assumed positions of leadership even. Eventually, every unit had a woman captain or a major that led men into battle. The inclusion of women reflected really the inclusion of all Mexico in this event. The Mexican philosopher and poet Octavio Paz called the uprising against Huerta a fiesta of bullets. He meant by this that despite the death and destruction, the war at times took on a strange festive atmosphere. Mexicans are very musical, and song followed all the armies. Moving relentlessly southward, Villa's army was the revolution's iron fist. Blocking his advance was the city of Torreon, a vital railroad center which he took after a furious struggle. Much closer to Mexico City was the ancient silver mining town of Zacatecas, which Villa took with a deadly uphill charge that he personally led. Because of this kind of leadership, Villa became a folk hero in the U.S. He was seen as a dashing peasant leader on a noble cause. John Reed, the American journalist, rode with Villa for 4 months and popularized his personal courage. After capturing Zacatecas, Villa's army swelled to 22,000, a large force now poised to strike Mexico City. But Carranza considered Mexico City his prize. He did not want Villa to steal his thunder and enter the city first, so Carranza's army controlled the railroad linking Zacatecas with vital coal deposits. Carranza halted coal deliveries and stopped Villa's advance. Villa swore revenge for this act, which was the first major split among the generals of the North. In July 1914, Huerta packed up millions of stolen pesos and quietly slipped away on a boat to Cuba. He died in 1916 in Texas of cirrhosis of the liver. The people of Mexico City waited with anxiety to see who would occupy the capital. The Villistas, the Obregonistas, whoever it was, they were afraid of them. In mid-August 1914, it was Obregon who finally marched into Mexico City in the wake of Huerta. People were terrified because they thought his men were wanton murderers, but he declared martial law and announced he would shoot all looters. He actually brought order where the city had experienced lawlessness in the last days of Huerta. Carranza arrived in Mexico City shortly afterward. The first chief now claimed political leadership of the nation. To legitimize his rule, Carranza called for a convention in the city of Aguascalientes. All revolutionary leaders were invited. Carranza thought he could dictate the terms of the convention and establish the new government of Mexico, sort of like George Washington did in Philadelphia. The delegates loyal to Villa and Zapata, however, took charge and demanded radical land redistribution per the Plan of Ayala. Carranza ordered his delegates to leave, and sensing a coming war between the generals, Carranza and Obregon retreated to Veracruz, once again leaving the city open and unguarded. Villistas and Zapatistas advanced from their separate directions on the city. Once more the residents were afraid, but especially the Zapatistas. And they came walking in first, and frankly they were impossible to distinguish as soldiers. They wore their cotton white peasant clothes, and they were actually very quiet and modest. People were relieved. Villistas arrived in early December 1914 in riding boxcars. They were peaceful at first, then some looted liquor stores, got drunk, and shot wild in the air. Residents prayed future celebrations would not get out of hand. Zapata and Villa met at this time in Mexico City. They seemed uncomfortable with each other despite similar goals. Zapata left shortly after, leaving the city to the Villistas, and after an initial period of civilized behavior, they became a pack of fiends. They looted and stole. Because of Villa's contempt for the church became a special target. Religious items of value were looted. Rape was common. Even on open streets, men who sometimes tried to rescue women being raped were shot. Villa and his troops eventually drifted out of the city, and we enter the general versus general phase. Villa versus Obregon, Carranza versus Zapata, even Obregon versus Carranza. Lesser generals, of course, did likewise. Combat was very ferocious. The nation broke into territories controlled by the generals. They even issued their own currencies. Villa's army traveled with a printing press, which printed money with his picture on it. There were 25 different kinds of money at one point, all worthless outside of Mexico. Only the Zapatistas issued money of value. They made it from silver with a hand press. The military strongman became a new ruling class. It made life miserable for campesinos, as hacendados had. They stripped the land bare of crops and livestock. As they traveled, men and women were forced to join the marauding armies just to get something to eat. 1915 became known as the Year of Hunger. Farm production was down, railroads controlled by generals. People starved. Respected women turned to prostitution just to get a few tortillas. Bodies from starvation were picked up by wagons and taken to mass graves outside of cities. This is one of the few functioning government services. Four men stood out: Villa, Carranza, Obregón, and Zapata. Zapata really didn't want the presidency. Politics eluded Villa. Obregón was willing to wait. This left Carranza at the top. And Obregón agreed to destroy Villa for Carranza because that was a necessary impediment to put Carranza in power. This turned out to be the bloodiest battle of the Revolution. Obregón was outnumbered considerably by Villa, but he knew Villa was moody and could be coaxed into battle on Obregón's terms. Obregón was fully aware of what was happening in Europe and developed an appreciation for machine guns. Next to the town of Celaya, Obregón ordered trenches dug. He installed machine guns and barbed wire. Villa seemed eager to attack. This Battle of Celaya began on April 6 of 1915, and the bottom line is it was disastrous for Villa and pretty much destroyed him as a serious military threat. Oh, and Obregón lost his arm. Carranza was delighted with Villa's destruction, but still faced Zapata. During 1915, Zapata organized really a separate society in the South, essentially declared the southern part of Mexico a separate country, and where he redistributed land. Carranza sent General Pablo Gonzalez. He was a miserable general, but he was very treacherous and pretty good at a scorched earth policy. He hanged hundreds of Zapatista sympathizers. He retook some cities, but he never really controlled the countryside. Zapata was revered as a saint. Now, the war between the generals worried Woodrow Wilson. U.S. owned $1 billion of property. The continued warfare meant this value was eroding. Businessmen wanted the U.S. Army to stop the war. Wilson tried to end the war by showing support for the man who seemed likeliest to win, Carranza. In October of 1915, Villa said the U.S. recognized Carranza as president and forbade arms be sold to any others. This infuriated Villa, who took revenge by, believe it or not, invading the United States. In March of 1916, he took 485 men to Columbus, New Mexico. He wanted to punish the U.S. and embarrass Carranza. 16 Americans were killed on U.S. soil. In response to Villa's incursion, Woodrow Wilson sent 6,000 troops to get Villa, dead or alive. General John Pershing commanded this. Carranza felt compelled to denounce this quote-unquote invasion, but could do nothing. And Pershing had no success ultimately in finding Villa, and he was hidden in these mountain lairs, and joked that his U.S. efforts to capture him were fruitless. So many pesos for so little ahead, he said. This somewhat restored Villa's image for Mexicans. Pershing eventually had to withdraw after about 10 months because he would be needed in Europe soon. This was about the time, by the way, of the Zimmerman telegram. So by early 1917, the fury of the fighting ebbed like a car running out of gas. Mexicans were simply exhausted. An uneasy political peace settled over northern Mexico. Carranza seemed to have emerged victorious in the war between the generals. Villa was demoted back to banditry. Zapata remained a force but was unlikely to march on Mexico City. Some 500 lesser generals still commanded armies. Carranza began pacifying these forces in a time-honored way. He paid them off. He offered ranches, lucrative state and federal government jobs. The reform ideals of the revolution, land and justice, were largely ignored by Carranza, but he was determined to give Mexico a constitution that would serve as a framework for a more enlightened government. And he called for a convention in the city of Querétaro. This was December of 1916. Villa and Zapata and their supporters were not invited. He hoped to dictate the terms of this convention. He favored a rewritten version of the 1857 Constitution, separation of church and state, no re-election of presidents, and he instructed delegates to steer clear of land redistribution issues. He and most of his friends were property owners. They represented really the middle class. As with Aguascalientes, control of the convention, however, did slip away from Carranza. The Constitution writers who met in Querétaro in December of 1916 were middle-class men. They were teachers, lawyers, shopkeepers. They were not radicals, but they had concern for the poor. They felt it was unreasonable to offer Mexico a rewritten version of a 60-year-old constitution after so much bloodletting, and so they wrote an amazing document that governs Mexico to this day. It was written in 6 weeks and approved February 5th, 1917. In many ways, it was progressive beyond the reformers' dreams. Most Mexican progressives wanted strict separation of church and state. The language was very strict on this issue. All education had to be public, all marriage civil. Churches could not own land beyond what the church stood on. Article 123 recognized the right to form unions. This was very radical. Also limited the workday to 8 hours, prohibited child labor, and established a minimum wage. No other nation in 1917 had such workers' rights in their constitution. Hottest question was land redistribution. And this, the Constitution had Article 27, which gave the right to the government to redistribute land as it saw fit. This meant that a government like Carranza's could drag its feet on land reform. Article 27 also stated that the wealth of the subsoil, the minerals and oil, may be used only by Mexicans or foreigners willing to obey all Mexican laws. Virtually unopposed, Carranza was elected president under the new Constitution in March of 1917. The Zapatistas refused to recognize him, however, and this infuriated Carranza. He ordered Gonzales to crush the Zapatistas once and for all. And he couldn't beat Zapata in battle, so Gonzales resorted to a trick. He ordered Colonel Jesus Guajardo to approach Zapata as a turncoat and offered to bring his troops and weapons over. This was not unusual, actually. So Gonzales even fought a sham battle against Guajardo, which he allowed Guajardo to win. People were even killed. Zapata desperately needed replacement soldiers and modern weapons, so he took the bait. He went to meet Guajardo at an abandoned hacienda, but he was, of course, ambushed and killed. Zapata was killed on April 10, 1919. His bullet-ridden body was taken by mule to the center of the city of Cuautla. He was tied to a post for days. Thousands came to see him in disbelief. Carranza was delighted. He promoted Guajardo to general, gave him 50,000 pesos. Now, in early 1920, Carranza's term was due to expire. He could not reasonably ask another term since no re-election was one of his strongest principles. So, before the elections, he threw his support behind an unknown guy named Ignacio Bonillas, who was the ambassador to Washington. Clearly, he meant to use him as his puppet. Carranza underestimated the popularity of Obregón. Obregón said no to this, and generals aligned with him in Sonora. They declared rebellion, started marching south. More and more joined them as they marched. Fearing for his life, Carranza predictably went to Veracruz and tried to form a government. The trip was a calamity. They were stranded in the state of Puebla because troops loyal to Obregón blew up the tracks. Carranza tried to continue on horseback. In his desperation, he gave gold to anyone who would help him. He paid a local cacique, a chieftain named Rodolfo Herrera, who was actually a secret Obregonista, and he was shot, supposedly committed suicide. And so Obregón occupied Mexico City. People wept for joy.